The mountain mist hung thick as milk, pouring through thatched rooftops and seeping into hair, clothing, and bone. In Nam Do, every wedding was a bloodline pilgrimage, a journey where hair entwined with hair, and secrets were stitched into the incense smoke, the lullabies of elders, and the silent, heavy gazes of mothers. Ang curled up on the old bamboo cot, watching her long hair spill across her back like a dark stream. Tonight, she would step through the threshold every daughter of her line had crossed, whether trembling, hopeful, or haunted. Her mother sat quietly beside her, fingers rough with calluses, gently smoothing each strand, her voice hoarse and her hands trembling as she worked a deep red thread. "Don't cry, child. The red veil is the blessing of our women." Her mother's voice was half comfort, half surrender, as if tying the final knot in a net already worn thin by too many winters. Ang did not cry. She just felt cold, so cold it rooted in her chest, as if some unseen hand pressed over her heart and dragged her downward into a nameless abyss. In the smoky kitchen, her grandmother muttered incantations, dipping brittle white hair into a bowl of beetle-red water, so each strand took on the shade of ancient blood. The mountain wind howled outside, making the candle flame shiver, casting shifting shadows on the mud walls, shapes that looked like the nameless spirits the elders spoke of only in whispers. Tonight was the night of weaving the veil, a ritual every Nam Do bride must endure. Every lock of hair, every loop of thread was a blood vow, a repository of pain, secrets, and sorrows that no one dared voice aloud. Her mother cut a long lock of her own head, weaving it carefully into a length of deep crimson, dyed with bark from the oldest tree and the blood of the clan's first matriarch, 7 generations gone. Her grandmother's trembling hands lifted the last wisps of her own silver hair and placed them in Ang's palm, forcing her to smell the age, the smoke, and the bitter tears that still clung to each strand. "Remember, tonight is a night of blood. Whoever severs the blood thread must pay, for life after life. But one who keeps the vow will be protected by her mother and grandmother, never lost, never alone." Her grandmother did not look at Ang, only whispered into the darkness, as if to the dead women crowding the corners of the room. A temple bell echoed from far down the valley, mingling with the shrill insects of the night. Every woman in the family quietly offered their own lock of hair to the straw basket, feeding the half-finished red veil, blood welling through fingers, darkening each stitch. Her aunts and cousins, all those who'd survived this ritual, came bearing small gifts. Some handed Ang a sprig of mugwort to keep the hair spirits from dragging you away at midnight. Others simply touched her shoulder as if to pass on the faint warmth left from their own lost girlhood. Ang shivered, her hands tightening as her grandmother's hair joined the growing shroud. Each time the needle pierced silk, she heard faint cries, half-remembered stories, sorrowful tales of women erased from memory, buried beneath generations. Outside, the crescent moon floated, its pale light glancing off the copper mirror where Ang caught herself, still a girl, but already haunted by the creases of her mother, the sharp chin of her grandmother, and eyes as deep as wells, holding centuries of silent rage. The ancestral altar stood in the corner. Above it, the faded portrait of a woman in a red wedding dress, the first mother of their line. Tonight, the portrait's eyes seemed alive, drilling into Ang, pleading and warning all at once. Her mother's voice broke the silence. "This blood veil will keep you safe, so the spirits of our line do not pull you away. But remember, never tear it, never let it rip. If you do, every curse will return for what is owed, now and forever." Ang sat perfectly still. Already something older than her own memories was awakening in her veins, something from every woman who'd ever worn the red veil on this night of covenant, before vanishing into the mountain fog, forever restless. Outside, the wind moaned, as if calling names from the far side of the ridge. The veil lay unfinished, every stitch burning like a curse waiting to be claimed. The first light of dawn barely pierced the fog, but the house already pulsed with anxious movement. Women's voices floated through thin walls, soft, secretive, thick with worry. The wedding day had arrived, though no laughter brightened the chilly air. Ing moved like a sleepwalker through rituals she'd been taught since childhood, her mind drifting far from the present. On the floor, the red veil awaited her, finished at last, its silken body heavy with fresh stitches, strange symbols embroidered in the deepest scarlet. Each mark was a secret prayer or an unspoken fear, sewn by hands that trembled with memory. Her mother's fingers worked quickly, oiling Ing's hair, braiding it tight, tucking away every stray strand. "Let no hair fall loose," she whispered, "or the ancestors will know you doubt them." Ing caught her mother's reflection in the copper mirror. Eyes red-rimmed, mouth pressed in a line of silent warning. As the veil was lifted, Ing's heart pounded in her throat. The weight of it was unnatural, cool and slightly damp, as if it had just come from a river. She could smell the faint bitterness of chow, the earthiness of old hair, and underneath it all, a sharp note of something like iron, like blood. Aunties surrounded her, fussing with beads, pinning charms into her sleeves, tying her wrists with thin red cords. Each gesture was a ward against spirits, against envy, against the unknown. "Don't speak until the ceremony ends. Don't look in the mirror with the veil on." Ing nodded, but her mind was already drifting. She remembered last night's dreams, women standing in rows behind her, faces blurred, mouths stitched shut with red thread. Their hands reached for her hair, for her neck, their eyes hollow with longing. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the back of the house, startling everyone. In the kitchen, a mirror had fallen, shattered on the cold floor. A sparrow crashed against the window and fell limp, a thin trail of blood marking the glass. The old women hissed and crossed themselves, muttering about bad omens. Her grandmother limped in, clutching a scrap of white cloth. "Let no shadow cross your path, child, and keep your eyes on the ground. Evil comes for those who dare look back." As the wedding procession gathered at the altar, the village seemed to shrink around Ing, each face a mask, each gesture stiff with superstition. Her fiancé waited in borrowed robes, eyes averted, hands trembling. The priestess began her chants, burning herbs that filled the house with an acrid, dizzying smoke. Ing felt her thoughts cloud and scatter. She barely heard the blessings, barely felt the knot tied in her sash, or the rice pressed into her palm. Everything blurred except the pressing, choking weight of the veil. Suddenly the chanting stopped. Gasps echoed around the room. Ing opened her eyes. Her fiancé was gone. Only his empty shoes remained on the mat, pointed toward the open door. A murmur rose, shocked, then accusatory. The villagers' eyes cut through her like knives. Her mother collapsed to her knees, wailing. The red veil slipped on Ing's head, tightening against her throat. A sharp, burning shame climbed Ing's neck. In a daze, she stumbled to the ancestral altar, tearing the veil from her head with shaking hands. The silk ripped, a sickening sound slicing through the heavy air. She flung the ruined veil on the floor before the black and white eyes of her ancestors. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. A silence so deep, it seemed to swallow every breath, every word. Then the wind began to howl through the cracks, and the candles guttered out, one by one. Behind Ing, the women wailed, but above it all, she heard something else. A whisper, soft, but cold as a grave. No one breaks the blood thread without paying the debt. Night fell with an unnatural swiftness, swallowing the village in a silence so deep it seemed as if the world itself was holding its breath. An sat motionless at the foot of the ancestral altar, surrounded by the tattered remains of the red veil. The torn silk seemed to pulse in the gloom, glistening wetly, as if weeping blood of its own. Outside, the wind had died. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and unmoving. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, then fell silent. Every creak of the bamboo, every breath from the women crowded in the house, felt heavy with accusation. Her mother was on the floor, rocking and muttering, my fault, why did I let her touch the blood thread?" Aunties whispered in corners, their faces pale and drawn. Superstition moved among them like a second shadow. An's throat ached where the veil had pressed, and her hands trembled in her lap. But beneath the numbness, a strange coldness crept through her chest, a sense of something vast and ancient, awake and watching. She glanced at the altar. The candles had burned low, their flames barely more than dying embers. The portrait of the clan's first mother looked different tonight, the painted eyes darker, the mouth twisted in a shape that almost seemed to sneer. A single strand of hair had fallen onto the altar, curling at the base of a chipped ceramic bowl. An reached out to brush it away, but as her fingers touched the strand, she felt a jolt, a memory not her own. A woman screaming in the river, hands tearing at a red veil underwater, a necklace of hair tightening around a throat, then blackness. An snatched her hand back, heart thundering. She stared at her own palm, half expecting to see blood, but there was nothing, only the faint, tingling imprint of another life. The old priestess entered, her footsteps barely a whisper. She moved to the altar, picking up the torn veil with shaking hands. "You have broken the covenant. You have split the thread that binds our mothers to this earth. Now their pain returns to you." One by one, the women began to chant, a low, keening sound that made the hairs on An's neck stand up. Outside, the fog thickened, pressing against the doors as if trying to slip inside. From the shadows, her grandmother appeared, eyes clouded with tears and fear. "It began with the river," she whispered to An, voice trembling. "Long ago, the first bride of our line was left alone, her veil torn and her heart drowned. From her sorrow the blood thread was born, and from it the curse." An felt the truth settle on her shoulders like an icy shawl. "Can it be undone?" she whispered. Her grandmother only shook her head. "Once the blood thread is broken, the debt must be paid. Grief does not die. It waits, it gathers, it finds a voice." The women's chanting grew louder, swirling around An until it felt as if the walls themselves were trembling. Shadows stretched across the floor, growing longer, darker, twisting into the shapes of women with hair like rivers and eyes like old wounds. The torn veil writhed in the priestess's hands, threads unspooling as if alive. The air thickened with the scent of iron, earth, and decay. Suddenly, the altar candle sputtered out. In the darkness, An felt a cold touch wrap around her neck. She gasped, clawing at invisible fingers, her vision filling with blinding red. A voice echoed inside her skull. All you sever, you must gather. All you deny, you must carry. The grip loosened. An collapsed forward, gasping for air. When she looked up, the altar was empty. The torn veil had vanished. But from somewhere behind her, deep in the walls or the bones of the house, she heard the first faint sobs of women long dead. Grief echoing through every stone, every memory, every drop of blood that made her who she was. And outside, in the hungry darkness, something ancient was moving closer. That night, no one slept in the house of mourning. The air was thick with prayers, incense, and fear. Every lamp burned low, their trembling lights drawing long shadows that flickered over grieving faces and walls stained with memory. An lay on her mat, eyes wide open, listening to the restless movements of her mother and grandmother in the rooms beyond. Outside, the fog pressed in, erasing the world, making the village feel like a tiny raft drifting alone on a sea of ghosts. She pressed her hand to her throat, still bruised from the unseen grip. The memory of that touch lingered, cold and unyielding. Each time she blinked, she saw flashes of someone else's pain, a woman's face screaming, a river churning red, the suffocating embrace of a hair rope wound tight. Sometime near midnight, a chill swept through the house, rattling the wooden beams. An heard the sound of weeping, low, desperate, and all too real. She rose, feet numb on the cold floor, and crept toward the source. In the kitchen, her mother knelt in front of the altar, hands twisted in her hair, sobbing into the darkness. The torn veil, somehow whole again, lay coiled on the altar, its crimson threads glistening as if wet with fresh blood. "Meh," An whispered, but her mother didn't answer. Instead, she began to pull at her braid, yanking, twisting until strands snapped in her hands. Suddenly, as if guided by some terrible force, her mother looped her own hair around her neck, her sobs turning to gasps. An rushed forward, screaming, but it was as if she moved through water. Her mother's face grew mottled, eyes wide in terror, mouth working soundlessly as the braid tightened, tighter. Then silence. Her mother's body slumped to the floor, the long braid still knotted around her neck, face frozen in a mask of pain and regret. An collapsed beside her, hands shaking, trying to undo the impossible knot. The hair was slick, cold, almost alive beneath her fingers. Behind her, footsteps shuffled, slow and shuffling. Her grandmother, eyes clouded with shock, appeared in the doorway. She didn't speak, didn't cry. She simply stared, as if seeing something far away. Then, as if pulled by an invisible string, the old woman turned and walked, silent and determined, out of the house and into the mist. An called out, but her voice was a whisper swallowed by the fog. Through the window, An saw her grandmother's small shape moving toward the river, white hair trailing like a banner. The mist closed in around her. Moments later, the house shuddered with a sudden gust, and the world fell utterly silent. An staggered back inside, numb. The house felt emptier than ever, a vessel drained of life, filled instead with the ache of unfinished stories and the echo of vanished voices. She dropped to her knees in front of the altar, the red veil gleaming with a cruel light. It was whole again, as if nothing had ever torn it. Only a single fresh drop of blood stained its edge. An wept, but the tears felt borrowed, echoes of countless other sorrows. In her mind, the whispered warning repeated, "All you sever, you must gather. All you deny, you must carry." The house creaked as if settling deeper into the earth. Somewhere outside, the river ran red beneath the moon. And as An bowed her head, the red veil watched, its threads twitching softly, hungrily, waiting for the next sorrow to bind. The sun never quite rose the next day. A pallid, colorless dawn crept over the mountain, bleeding gray light into An's home. She wandered through the rooms as if in a trance, her mother's body taken away before sunrise, her grandmother still missing, the silence in the house heavier than death. On the family altar, the red veil had returned, whole, immaculate, but somehow changed. An's gaze snagged on a new pattern, strange symbols embroidered along the edge and a thread the color of old bruises. Each time she looked, the shapes seemed to writhe, forming unfamiliar faces, open mouths, staring eyes. Her hands shook as she reached for the veil. It felt warm and damp, as if it had absorbed tears and blood alike. As she lifted it, a pinprick of pain shot up her arm. She gasped and dropped the veil, staring at her wrist. There, just below the skin, was a thin, red line, almost like a seam. The pain grew sharper each hour. By midday, a network of red lines had appeared on her arms and neck, weaving up her body like stitches. She tried to scrub them away, but the more she rubbed, the more the lines seemed to burrow under her skin. Her mind fogged. She wandered through memories not her own. A bride suffocating under a river's surface, her veil snagged on roots. A woman's hands trembling as she braided a newborn's hair, whispering blessings through gritted teeth. A child shunned by her village, the mark of a broken vow burning on her forehead. The house grew colder, and with every shadow, An felt watched. When she peered into the copper mirror, her own face flickered, sometimes older, sometimes young, sometimes twisted into a silent scream. There were moments when she didn't recognize herself at all. One night, as sleep hovered just out of reach, An awoke to a strange sensation, something cool and silken wrapping slowly around her throat. Her hand shot up and closed around the red veil, which was no longer on the altar, but now wound tightly about her neck. It squeezed gently at first, then with increasing pressure, as if it testing her will. She tore at the veil, struggling for breath. In that moment she heard voices, not in her ears, but in the back of her mind. A chorus of women's laments. "You tore the thread. You carry what we could not finish. We will not be forgotten. You will not be free." With a desperate burst of strength, An yanked the veil away, but as it fell to the floor, she saw, horrified, that blood now seeped from the embroidered symbols, staining her hands. She stumbled to the wash basin, splashing water on her face, but the red lines under her skin only glowed brighter. Her breath came in short, frantic bursts. She tried to recall her mother's lullaby, her grandmother's voice, the warmth of family, but each memory slipped away, replaced by the sobs and screams of countless women lost to history. Each day her senses faded, the taste of rice bland on her tongue, the smell of incense gone. Names blurred, then disappeared. When she looked in the mirror, she saw not her own reflection, but a procession of unfamiliar faces, some young, some ancient, all with eyes hollowed out by grief. An realized, with cold clarity, that the curse was not just in the veil, but now sewn into her very flesh. the blood thread, once broken, would not rest until every wound, every sorrow, every forgotten name had found a voice through her. Outside, the village carried on in fearful silence, pretending not to notice the girl whose shadow grew thinner, whose voice was lost, whose reflection no longer belonged to her alone. And in the darkest corner of the room, the red veil pulsed, alive and waiting, as the stitches on An's skin drew ever tighter. Nights lost their boundaries. Sleep offered no relief, only deeper layers of dread. An's world was now one of shadows that crept across the walls, shapes that flickered and vanished at the edge of her vision. Even in daylight, the rooms of her house seemed dimmer, the corners crowded with presences she could no longer ignore. The red stitches along her arms ached constantly, some days burning, some days numb. Whenever she touched them, voices trembled beneath her skin, indistinct, sometimes whispering, sometimes sobbing. She could not tell if the words were in a language she'd forgotten or a grief that needed no translation. She tried to busy herself with chores, but everything went wrong. Water spilled, rice burned. Her fingers fumbled, as if directed by memories not her own. Each time she brushed her hair, loose strands fell in impossible quantities, long, black, white, even silver, coiling in the comb like the offerings of 100 women. At night, the house filled with the scent of wet earth and old incense. Dreams came thick as fog. A woman stood in a ruined bridal dress, her face hidden by a mass of tangled hair, red thread sewn across her lips. A young girl crouched in a dark corner, clutching a bloodied lock of hair, rocking and humming a song that made An's teeth ache with sorrow. Sometimes in the distance, her mother's voice called to her, urgent and echoing. But when An tried to follow, the floor turned to water, and the walls bled long black strands. One evening, just after sunset, the air in the house thickened. An felt the chill before she saw the shapes, figures of women, wavering and translucent, gathering in every doorway and corner. Their eyes, hollow, rimmed in darkness, fixed on her with unbearable longing. One reached for her, fingers pale and impossibly thin. An's skin crawled at the cold touch. "Give it back," the woman whispered, her mouth barely moving. "Let us finish what was undone." An tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her voice, once so clear, was little more than a croak. The red veil had stolen her words too. She stumbled backward, pressing herself against the altar. Tears stung her eyes as the figures swayed closer, their lips all stitched shut, except for the old grandmother, who spoke with a voice like wind in a crypt. "Every generation carries what the last could not bury. You severed the blood thread, child. Now you must gather us home." An's mind fractured. Images flashed, women she'd never met, pain she'd never lived, regrets she couldn't name. She was drowning in a river of memory, dragged down by hands she couldn't see. Suddenly, the candle beside the altar flickered wildly. Shadows stretched and bent, and the figures vanished in a single silent breath, leaving only the scent of trowel and sorrow lingering in the air. An collapsed to her knees, sobbing soundlessly. Her body, her thoughts, even her voice no longer belonged only to her. She understood now she was no longer just An, but the vessel for every woman whose pain had never been named, whose sorrow had been bound by the red thread. The house creaked as the night deepened. In the distance, a mournful cry rose from the river, answered by the restless hush of wind in the trees. And as she lay trembling on the cold floor, An realized her only hope was to seek the truth of the curse, to follow the voices, to face the shadows with no name, and to try, however futile, to return what had been broken before she disappeared into the veil herself. Sleep did not come easily, nor did waking feel real. Ang drifted in and out of consciousness, caught in a web spun by the pain and longing of countless women before her. Her body ached, her mouth dry, and her limbs were leaden with exhaustion that no rest could soothe. That night, as the fog crept through every crack and the wind moaned along the eaves, Ang heard it, a lullaby, faint at first, then rising, beautiful and broken, sung in a language older than memory. The melody wound through the house like smoke, carrying with it the taste of ashes and old tears. Ang followed it, barefoot and shivering, drawn down the dark hall toward the altar. There, beneath the gaze of the clan's first mother, shadows gathered. They moved in time with the song, their outlines flickering in the candle's uncertain glow. The old grandmother's voice rose above the others, cracked but strong, singing verses Ang had never heard before. "Hush now, little bride. Don't let your sorrow show. Hide it under silk and thread. Let no one ever know." The lullaby pressed on her heart like a cold hand. Ang remembered her own mother's voice, softer and sadder, humming the same tune when she was small. But now she heard the pain woven through every note, the hidden grief, the dreams silenced for generations. The shadows parted, and visions spilled out like water from a broken dam. A girl knelt at the riverbank, hands raw from scrubbing blood out of a wedding dress, tears carving muddy streaks on her face. A woman sat before the altar, her hair shorn, lips trembling as she sewed her own sorrow into the red veil. An old woman rocked a baby in the night, whispering the lullaby through cracked lips, promising protection she could not give. Ang saw herself among them, her own mouth stitched shut, her hands trying to tear the threads, but failing, always failing. Each woman looked back at her, their eyes pleading, angry, afraid. The song shifted, growing sharper, the words turning into a warning. "Break not the blood thread, spill not the red, carry our stories, or be haunted instead." The pain in Ang's chest tightened, and she gasped for air. She understood now. The lullaby was not for comfort, it was a binding, a spell to keep the grief hidden, to trap it within the bloodline, passed from mother to daughter, unbroken except by sorrow or rage. Suddenly, the shadows converged. Her grandmother stepped forward, her face gaunt and haunted. "Do you see, child? This is what we left for you. All that was unfinished, all that was forbidden to speak. You cannot run. You must listen. You must remember." Ang sobbed, falling to her knees. "But I am not strong enough. I cannot carry it all." Her grandmother's voice softened, old and unbearably tired. "We were never meant to carry it alone. But the curse was made by those who refused to grieve, who silenced our pain. Now it waits for someone brave or desperate enough to gather the broken pieces and let the truth be heard." The lullaby faded, leaving only the silence of the dead. The candle guttered, shadows melting back into the walls. Ang was left alone, kneeling before the altar, the red veil coiled at her feet like a sleeping serpent. For the first time, she heard not only the curse, but the plea within it. "Remember us. let our sorrow be seen. Only then can the blood thread rest." But even as she understood, she felt the veil shift, its threads itching against her skin, a reminder that the cost of breaking silence might be more than she could bear. Outside, the night pressed closer, and somewhere in the darkness, the lullaby began again, promising that nothing, no secret, no sorrow, would stay buried forever. The fog did not lift with the morning. It lingered heavy and thick, draping the world in gray. An's head throbbed with sleeplessness and the weight of too many voices crowding her thoughts. She could not stay inside any longer. The walls of the house pressed in with every breath. The red veil seemed to pulse, daring her to run. Clutching her coat, An slipped outside. The air was cold and sharp, thick with the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. The village was silent, windows shuttered, doors barred. She walked quickly, following the half-remembered path to the river, the place her grandmother had vanished. Each step felt heavier, as if unseen hands tried to hold her back. Her shadow trailed behind her, thinner than before, stitched to her heels by red threads only she could see. When she reached the riverbank, the world felt oddly still. The mist pressed low over dark, glassy water. An stood for a long moment, listening. The water moved beneath the fog, swirling with the memory of tears and blood. Then, from the reeds, a figure emerged, a woman hunched with age, her back bent like a question mark, her long gray hair hanging in thick, tangled ropes. Her skin was the color of river silt, and her eyes shone sharp and cold. "You come for the lost, do you?" the old woman croaked. An hesitated, her mouth dry. I'm looking for my grandmother. She walked into the river last night. Have you seen her?" The woman laughed, a sound like pebbles knocking together. "All grandmothers end up here, child. The river carries their debts." She pointed a bony finger at An's throat, where the marks of the veil still lingered. "But your debt is heavier. You tore the thread." An's heart lurched. "Please, tell me how to break the curse. I can't carry it anymore. I don't even know whose sorrow I feel. It's all become one long ache." The old woman's eyes narrowed. She knelt by the water, tracing circles in the mud. "You are not the first to ask. Long ago, a bride waited on these banks, her heart split open by betrayal. Her wedding veil was torn as she drowned herself here. Hair and silk tangled, blood swirling in the river. The curse was born from her grief, and every daughter since has been bound by her unfinished pain." An knelt beside the woman, staring into the swirling water. For a moment, she saw faces drift beneath the surface, women young and old, eyes wide with longing and loss. "But why must we suffer for her sorrow?" An whispered, tears stinging her eyes. The old woman shook her head, voice suddenly soft. "Sorrow that is never mourned becomes a debt. Mothers pass it to daughters, and the river grows deeper every generation. The red thread is not just a curse, it is a warning. Break it, and you become the vessel. Refuse it, and the river will claim you too." The words fell on An like rain, cold and relentless. She thought of her grandmother's empty gaze, her mother's broken body, the way every woman she'd seen in her dreams had reached for her with desperate hands. The old woman rose, her silhouette blurring into the fog. "If you want release, child, you must return what was taken. Bring the veil to the water and offer what is owed. A truth buried, a name remembered, a wound opened at last." An stared after her, heart pounding. The river lapped at her feet, hungry and patient. She clutched the red veil close to her chest, knowing the path forward would demand more courage and more pain than she'd ever known. Behind her, the mist thickened, and the old woman's voice drifted back, a final warning. "Debts must be paid, in blood or in memory. Choose well, or the river will choose for you." An returned home with her heart heavy and her hands numb, the old woman's warning echoing in her ears. The village seemed even more silent than before, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to act. Each step she took was uncertain, her mind tangled in fear and ancient sorrow. Inside, the house was dark. The only light came from a single candle burning low on the altar, casting warped shadows across the floor. The red veil, warm and weighty in her hands, seemed to throb with each heartbeat. An approached the copper mirror on the wall, the one that had belonged to her great-grandmother, a mirror polished by generations of women who had whispered secrets and prayers to their own reflections. She gazed into it, expecting to see her own familiar face, but the face that looked back was not hers. First, the changes were subtle. A line at the corner of the mouth, a gray strand in the hair, a shape of the jaw that was not quite her own. An blinked, heart pounding, but the changes did not fade. Instead, they deepened. Her cheeks hollowed, her skin grew sallow, her eyes ringed with shadow. Suddenly, the features shifted completely. A new face emerged, older, sorrowful, lips pressed thin. Then another, a woman with eyes filled with rage and regret, hair braided tightly beneath a faded red veil. Then another, young and frightened, mouth stitched shut with red thread. One after another, the faces of the women who had come before her flashed across the glass, some weeping, some silent, some staring with hollow eyes that seemed to see through An and beyond her, into the centuries. She felt their pain like 1,000 tiny needles pricking beneath her skin. The red stitches on her arms itched and burned, the heat creeping up her neck. As she reached to touch her face, her reflection copied the gesture, but the hand in the mirror was not her own. It was wrinkled, trembling, marked with scars and burns. Voices rose from the depths of the glass, whispering, "Remember us. Do not look away. We are you. You are us. We cannot be freed until you see us." An squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the flood of memory, but the images would not let go. She saw her grandmother, standing by the river, her hair loose and wild, singing the lullaby of the dead. She saw her mother, sitting alone in the kitchen, weeping quietly as she braided her own hair, the red veil draped over her lap. She saw women whose names she had never learned, their lives reduced to sorrow, their stories tangled together like so many knots in a single thread. An gasped, stumbling back from the mirror. Her head swimmed with grief and confusion. Who was she now? Was she still herself? Or had the blood thread devoured her piece by piece? In the silence, the red veil slipped from her arms and pooled at her feet. Its embroidery seemed to shimmer, each symbol a window into another woman's agony. With trembling hands, An gathered the veil and wrapped it around her shoulders. The cloth felt heavier than ever, as if all her foremothers were pressing close, demanding to be seen, to be remembered, to be mourned at last. The candle on the altar flickered. For a moment, the house filled with the faint scent of jasmine and burning hair. An looked again into the mirror. This time she saw not one face, but many layered over each other, shifting and blurring, a tapestry of sorrow and survival. Their lips moved together, mouthing words only she could hear. End this for us. Tell the truth. Let the blood thread finally rest. An sank to the floor, breathless and hollow. Tears slipped down her cheeks, falling silently onto the veil in her lap. She knew now, to break the curse, she would have to give voice to every woman inside her, no matter the cost. The mirror's surface shimmered, and somewhere deep within it, a door seemed to open, inviting her to step through. Outside, the wind rose. Inside, the past pressed ever closer. Desperation burned through An as dusk crept over the village once more. The memory of the shifting faces in the mirror haunted her with every blink. Her body ached, skin crawling with the phantom pain of generations. The red stitches along her arms pulsed with a heat that felt almost alive. She could no longer bear it. The voices, the sorrow, the feeling that her life was slipping away, thread by crimson thread. The red veil lay on her bed, splayed like a living wound. Its embroidery writhed with every breath, symbols warping into gaping mouths and weeping eyes. An's hand shook as she snatched the veil, clutching it so tightly her knuckles blanched. She stumbled outside, heart thundering, searching for fire, a final, desperate hope that flame might end what blood had begun. In the yard, she piled sticks and dry leaves into a trembling heap, struck a match, and watched the flames spring hungrily to life. The night wind carried the scent of burning wood and something older, wilder. With a cry, she flung the red veil onto the fire. At first, nothing happened. The veil sat atop the flames, its color bright and unnatural, refusing to burn. The fire crackled, licking at the silk, but the cloth curled without blackening, writhing like a serpent in pain. Suddenly, the flames sputtered and shrank, and a thick red smoke billowed from the veil. The smoke coiled around An, wrapping her in a suffocating shroud. She coughed, choking, eyes stinging. Through the haze, she saw, horrified, that her own hair was falling in clumps, drifting down to the earth like bloody petals. She clawed at her scalp, panic rising as blood oozed from the roots. The red stitches on her arms blazed, splitting open and leaking thin lines of blood that trickled down to her wrists. The world spun. She heard the voices again, louder now, more insistent, woven together in a shriek of anguish. You cannot destroy what you carry in your flesh. We bled so you could be born. You bleed so we can be remembered. An stumbled backward, falling to her knees. The veil, untouched by fire, slid from the flames, dragging a trail of blood across the earth. As she stared, the symbols embroidered on the veil began to writhe and spread, snaking off the cloth and etching themselves onto her skin. Faces, eyes, hands, each mark a woman's memory, seared into her flesh. Her body became a living tapestry of all that had come before: grief, rage, longing, and love, written in wounds and red thread. Pain flashed through her, dizzying and deep. She sobbed, curling in on herself as memories not her own crashed over her in waves. A mother giving away her child to save her from her husband's wrath. A bride locked in a dark room, the sound of celebration muffled by her own cries. A little girl hiding her hair beneath a cap, ashamed of a secret shame that was not hers alone. The veil slithered across the ground and wound itself gently around An's throat, not choking, but holding, reminding. When the pain faded, An was left gasping in the ashes, her hair thin, and her arms and neck a patchwork of fresh scars and angry living thread. The fire died. The night swallowed the last of the smoke. The veil, bright and unsinged, rested in her lap. An rocked herself, shivering. She could not destroy the blood thread, not by fire nor by will. The curse was not just in the veil, it was sewn into her bones, her blood, her story. And as she wept into the darkness, the faces on her skin blinked open their eyes and watched. The days grew shorter, the fog more stubborn. The sun was little more than a rumor, its light barely touching the ground. Wang's house became an island of shadow, but soon she realized she was not the only one haunted. All through the village, women began to fall ill, first with headaches and fevers, then with strange bouts of weeping and fits of rage. Some wandered the lanes at night, hair wild and eyes vacant, mumbling to themselves or calling out for mothers long dead. Children were kept indoors. Husbands muttered about bad omens, blaming the wind, the season, or the restless dead. Wang passed through the market one morning, and every conversation stopped as she approached. The other women stared, some with fear, some with silent accusation. She heard whispers, "It's the blood thread. She's brought the curse upon us all." At the edge of the crowd, an old woman spat and made a warding sign with her fingers, her face creased with centuries of dread. Rumors spread quickly. A woman in the next house over had been found at dawn, her hair torn out in handfuls, red marks ringing her wrists. A girl, barely 13, had collapsed in the field, muttering in a tongue no one recognized. Another widow was discovered standing in the river, skirt soaked to her waist, staring into the current, as if waiting for something or someone to return. At night, the wailing of women drifted through the fog, punctuated by sudden shrieks or the hollow laughter of the mad. The elder, who once dismissed all talk of curses, began burning incense at every crossroads, scattering ashes at doorways, and advising everyone to avoid mirrors and never to utter the names of the dead. Wang watched the world unravel with growing horror and guilt. She felt the red veil tugging her spirit at odd hours, as if demanding she account for each new misery. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she saw the village itself as a body, a web of veins all pulsing with the same old sorrow, each woman a beating heart, joined by threads she could not cut. On the seventh night, a group of men came to Wang's house. They stood at the door with torches and stern faces, demanding to see the veil. "You must burn it, bury it, throw it in the river, anything. Our wives are losing their minds. Our daughters wake up screaming. You have brought this evil here." Wang stood in the doorway, the red veil clutched in her hands. She tried to speak, but her voice was only a thin croak, barely more than a whisper. "This curse is not new. It's always been here, beneath our feet, inside our blood. You can't destroy it with fire or water." The men shouted, threatening to tear the veil from her by force. Wang shook her head, too weary for fear. "If you break it, it will only spread further. What you carry in your bones cannot be drowned." At her words, the oldest man flinched as if struck. For a moment she saw pity in his eyes, but also the terror of someone who knows the truth and cannot bear it. That night no one slept. Wang sat with the veil wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the keening wind and the distant rising chorus of grief. In the darkness, she saw the faces of the afflicted women flickering at her window, hair streaming behind them like banners of war. The curse was no longer hidden. It was loose, spilling through the village, binding every woman to the old pain, demanding to be seen, to be answered, to be mourned at last. And as the night wore on, Wang understood. This was not just her suffering. The blood thread tied them all together, and it would not be silenced, not by fear, nor fire, nor denial, until every voice was heard. Sleep became impossible. Night and day blurred together in a haze of grief and feverish dreams. An's arms throbbed with the pain of the red stitches, her thoughts invaded by 1,000 voices, each pleading, each angry, each aching to be free. When she could bear it no longer, An wrapped herself in a shawl, tucked the red veil beneath her coat, and slipped out of her house as dawn broke, a thin, ghostly light filtering through the fog. She knew what she must do: seek out the old ways, the true origins of the blood thread, and beg for the knowledge to break the chain. The path led her to the edge of the village, where the woods grew thick and the ground was damp with memories. There, among the twisted roots, lived the oldest of the village's wise women, a crone who had survived more than one lifetime and whose hair had grown white with secrets. An found her hunched over a cauldron, boiling herbs and chanting quietly. The old woman glanced up, her gaze sharp and ancient. "You come to ask about the blood, child? You are late. The dead have already gathered." An fell to her knees. "I can't carry their sorrow any longer. The village is dying. I have seen women I never knew, mothers, daughters, brides crying through my eyes. Please tell me what I must do." The crone stirred her pot, eyes never leaving An. "The thread is older than any curse, older than this village. It is a covenant of pain and silence, one broken only by truth or death. Do you know how your foremothers first made it?" An shook her head, clutching the red veil to her chest. "Long ago," the old woman said, "when the first bride was betrayed and drowned, her sisters gathered her hair and wove it into silk, binding their grief so it would not poison the river forever. But sorrow that is not spoken grows heavier with each generation. Every stitch, every vow, every silence, it all becomes a debt." An's tears came hot and fast. "How do I pay it back? How do I end it?" The crone leaned in close, her breath smelling of smoke and bitter herbs. "You must bring the veil to the place where the river meets the stone, the first altar where the covenant began. There you must offer what the curse demands: a voice for the voiceless, a memory for the forgotten, a wound open to the night. If you have the strength, you may survive. If not, your sorrow will join theirs forever." An bowed her head, clutching the veil as it pulsed against her heart. "But beware," the crone whispered. "The river hungers. If you try to cheat it, if you bargain or run, the blood thread will bind you tighter. Go with truth or not at all." An arose, feeling a strange new clarity settle over her. The way forward would be perilous. She would have to face not only the spirits of the dead, but her own fears, her own shame, her own hidden wounds. Yet for the first time, hope flickered in her chest. She turned to leave, but the old woman called out, "Take this, child." She pressed a sprig of wormwood into An's palm. "For protection. You will need it before the end." With trembling fingers, An tucked the herb into her pocket and set off through the mist, the red veil a living weight in her arms. As she walked, the chorus of women's voices surged in her mind, not just sorrow now, but a longing for release. She would walk to the place where pain began, and there she would pay the debt in full. And behind her, the village watched, some with hope, some with dread, as the last daughter of the blood thread vanished into the fog, heading toward fate and the river that remembered everything. On followed the path through the tangled forest, the mist thickening with every step. Shadows shifted between the trees. Sometimes she caught glimpses of faces in the pale light, watchful, mournful, almost familiar. The river's murmur grew louder, not only water on stone, but something deeper, like breath and memory mingling in the darkness. She reached the place where stone met water, a clearing overgrown with moss, the stones black with age, etched with symbols that pulsed faintly red in the dusk. Here, her foremothers had once gathered. Here, the first blood thread had been woven, and the first vow sealed. On laid the red veil on the altar, her fingers trembling. The embroidery writhed as if alive, threads tugging her forward. She knelt, scissors in hand, and cut a lock of her own hair. For a moment she hesitated, but the wind shifted, carrying with it the voices of all those who'd come before. "We are here! We are waiting!" With shaking hands, An began to weave her hair into the veil, knotting it into the old stitches, her blood from a fresh cut mixing with the ancient silk. The pain was sharp, real, a tether to the living world. Each time the needle passed through, she whispered the names she remembered, her mother, her grandmother, women from stories half forgotten. For each name, a single drop of blood beaded on her finger, staining the silk. As she worked, the forest thickened with shadow. The air grew heavy, charged with a chill that prickled her skin. All around the altar, the spirits began to appear, first as flickers of pale light, then as women in faded wedding robes, hair hanging long and tangled, eyes burning with centuries of grief and hope. They pressed in, circling the altar, their faces shifting between agony and longing. Some wept silently, some watched with fierce hunger. Each time An hesitated, a hand would rest on her shoulder, cold, insistent, guiding her needle. One spirit stepped forward, her features sharp and ancient, the clan's first bride, her eyes both loving and filled with sorrow. "You have come where we could not. You have named what we could not speak," she whispered, her voice like wind over water. "Will you finish what we began?" An's vision blurred with tears. "I will try. I am afraid, but I will try." The spirits closed in, their fingers woven into the veil with hers, the altar glowing red where the blood touched stone. As An completed the final knot, the women began to sing, not the lullaby of silence, but a lamentation, raw and rising, a song of truth and pain and freedom. The veil trembled in her hands, warm and alive. An felt the stitches tighten and burn on her skin, every wound flaring with the voices of the dead. The sorrow was almost unbearable, a tide of regret, loss, and rage that threatened to drown her. But beneath it all, she sensed something new, a letting go, a loosening, as if chains were being broken, and the weight of generations was shifting. The faces around her grew softer, their eyes shining with gratitude and relief. The song faded, and the night grew still. An, dizzy and spent, pressed the bloodied veil to her heart. The spirits began to fade, one by one, their features peaceful at last. The first bride lingered a moment longer, her hand brushing An's cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, before dissolving into mist. An collapsed before the altar, breath shallow, her body marked with new scars. But for the first time, the silence around her felt gentle, not empty, but filled with the presence of all those who had come before and finally been set free. Above her, the moon broke through the clouds, silver light bathing the stones, the river, and the trembling red veil, a promise that the past, once faced, need not bind the future forever. The forest felt different as An made her way home. The air was still thick with mist, but the heaviness of sorrow that had pressed upon her every step was lighter, thinned out like a storm that had finally spent itself. Every sound seemed distant, her own footsteps, the river's whisper, even the wind as it curled through the treetops. When An reached her house, the village was silent. Doors were shut tight, lanterns dimmed. A dog barked once and fell silent, as if it too sensed something strange had passed. Inside, her home felt altered, emptied of old grief, but also unfamiliar. An crossed the threshold with the red veil wrapped carefully in her arms. Her body was exhausted, her wounds raw and aching, but she knew the worst was not yet over. She looked for her reflection out of habit, longing for reassurance that she was still herself. But every mirror in the house, her mother's old copper hand glass, the polished panel by the altar, even the little pool of water in the washing basin, was broken or clouded, the surfaces cracked and splintered as if they'd exploded from within. Where once she had caught glimpses of herself and the women who'd come before, now there was only darkness and warped, shifting shadows. An's breath caught. Had the ritual freed the others only to leave her without anchor? Was she still An, or just a vessel emptied of names and faces, wandering a room where no one could be seen or remembered? She wandered from room to room, fingertips brushing the jagged edges of the shattered mirrors. Each one seemed colder than glass, as if a winter wind still clung to its pieces. When she tried to peer into a fragment, the only thing she saw was her own eye, bloodshot and hollow, surrounded by darkness. In the kitchen, she found her mother's comb, a few black hairs still tangled in its teeth. The sight made her chest ache with longing and regret. She pressed the red veil to her heart and sat, rocking gently, letting herself remember the women who'd once filled this house with laughter, with song, with whispered stories in the night. But the memories came jumbled now, as if the past and present were threads twisted too tightly to separate. She saw herself at the altar, weaving hair and blood into silk. She saw her mother singing by candlelight, her grandmother kneeling at the river's edge. She saw faces she had never known and heard voices that spoke in languages long dead. The world tilted, and for a moment she felt herself dissolve, each piece of her becoming a story, a sorrow, a hope for freedom. As darkness gathered outside, An realized that, without the mirrors, she could not measure where she ended and the ancestors began. But perhaps that was the gift and the price, to be more than one life, to be the memory, the wound, and the healer. She rose, her hand steadied despite her exhaustion, and moved to the altar. Carefully, she placed the red veil beside the unlit candle and bowed her head. The house was utterly silent, yet as she listened, she felt a gentle warmth behind her, an invisible crowd, the breath of her foremothers close and kind. "I remember you," An whispered, her voice stronger than she expected. and I am still here." For the first time in many nights, she closed her eyes and let sleep come. No voices wailed, no shadows pressed at the walls, only the feeling that she was surrounded not by curses, but by all the lives that had made hers possible. And when she dreamed, it was not of sorrow, but of a house filled with light, laughter, and a girl whose face, finally, belonged to herself. Rain came with the night, lashing the rooftops and drumming on the windows until the village seemed to dissolve into shadow and water. Thunder rolled through the mountains, and lightning revealed the world in stark silvery flashes. An awoke to a whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then she heard her name, carried through the house in her grandmother's cracked, gentle voice. "An, child, come, the river waits." She rose from her bed, every muscle aching, the mark of the veil still faintly visible at her throat. The house was dark, the world beyond the door churning with mist and rain. Yet something drew her onward, and so, clutching the red veil, An stepped barefoot into the storm. The rain chilled her to the bone. Her nightgown clung to her skin, but she did not falter. The path to the river was lit only by lightning, the trees looming like silent witnesses. The world was muffled, the sound of the river louder than her own heartbeat. And there, standing on the far bank, was her grandmother, shrouded in white, hair flowing wild and silver. Her feet hovered inches above the ground, and her face, though older, glowed with a serenity An had never seen before. An waded through the mud, her feet sinking with every step, until she stood across the rushing current from the apparition. The air between them shimmered with memory, pain and love, regret and forgiveness, all bound together. Her grandmother raised a hand. "The river has taken so much from us. It has kept our secrets, held our sorrow. Tonight, you must give back what was bound, so that neither of us need wander any more." An's hand shook as she unwrapped the red veil, feeling its weight shift from burden to offering. She remembered every stitch, every wound, every name. The wind whipped her hair across her face, mixing her tears with the rain. The old woman beckoned. "Let go, child." With trembling fingers, An lifted the veil above her head and let it drift down onto the surface of the river. The silk unfurled, a streak of crimson against the black water, and was immediately caught by the current. Lightning split the sky. The veil was drawn downstream, spinning and glimmering until it vanished around a bend. An stood shivering, watching as her grandmother's figure grew brighter, almost transparent, her edges softened by the rain. "Thank you, An. You have remembered for us all." The spirit smiled, soft, proud, and free, before fading into the mist, leaving An alone in the storm. But she did not feel alone. For the first time, the weight at her heart was gone, replaced with a deep, aching peace. She turned for home, feeling the rain cleanse her skin and the river cleanse her blood. Behind her, the storm began to pass. The path back was clear, the night gentler than she remembered. At the threshold of her house, An looked back at the silent river and whispered into the dark, "We are free now, all of us." Inside, the house welcomed her, not as a prison, but as a home. Morning dawned still and soft. The storm swept away. For the first time in what felt like years, sunlight crept through the curtains, warming An's face as she stirred from a dreamless sleep. Her limbs felt lighter, The air in the house was no longer thick with sorrow. It shimmered, bright and unfamiliar. She wandered from room to room, half expecting to find the red veil waiting for her, coiled on the altar or draped across her bed. But it was gone, no trace left behind. The copper mirror on the wall, once cracked and haunted, now reflected only her own eyes, clear and dark, without the shifting faces of generations. Yet as An gazed at her reflection, a chill ran through her. Something, someone was missing. Names hovered on the edge of her mind, just out of reach. She tried to recall her mother's voice, her grandmother's lullaby, the details of the old stories that once filled every room, but the memories slipped away like water through her fingers. In the village, too, there was a hush. The women who had suffered with her now moved about their days with quiet purpose. Their eyes, no longer shadowed, held peace and a kind of gentle confusion. Some greeted An with blank smiles, as if seeing her for the first time. Children laughed in the lanes. The heaviness of grief had lifted, but so too had the memories of why it had been there. An walked to the river, drawn by instinct more than memory. The water ran clear and swift, its surface untouched by crimson or shadow. She knelt at the bank, watching the current swirl, and tried to recall the face of the woman she had seen there so often in dreams. But even the pain of that loss was gone, replaced by a strange calm. For a long time, An sat in silence, feeling the sun on her skin and the breeze in her hair. She was free, no longer weighed down by the sorrow of generations, but that freedom came with a cost she hadn't foreseen. When she returned home, she found the altar empty, the candle stub melted away. Her scars, once bright and angry, had faded to faint lines, almost invisible. She pressed her hand to her heart and felt only the steady, living beat of her own pulse. That night, as darkness fell, An lit a single candle and sat alone, letting the quiet fill her. She whispered into the stillness, not knowing if anyone would hear. "I let you go. I remember that I once remembered you, and I hope, wherever you are, your pain has ended." Her words vanished into the gentle hush. The house felt new, stripped of ghosts, but also of the old warmth, the old ache. She did not cry. She simply let the night hold her, empty and light. Outside, the river sang to itself beneath the moon, a lullaby with no words, its debts at last repaid. The days passed gently, like ripples across the river. The village blossomed in the sudden peace. Children ran laughing in the streets. The market hummed with bright voices, and the air tasted new, sweetened by freedom from old grief. An found herself growing stronger, her hands quick and sure as she worked in the garden. At times, she wondered if the curse had only been a fever dream, if the years of sorrow and haunting had belonged to another life. The scars on her arms faded to nothing. Sometimes, when she looked in the mirror, she saw only herself, solitary, content, and whole. But one morning, a soft commotion stirred her from her work. A line of women moved slowly down the path to the oldest house in the village. Mothers, daughters, grandmothers, carrying gifts, baskets, and bundles of red silk. In their midst walked a girl, barely 16, her head bowed beneath a mass of glossy black hair. An's breath caught. She watched as the procession entered the house, and soon the sound of song and laughter drifted out the windows. There was no heaviness in the melody, only joy and hope for the young bride's future. Curious, An walked closer, drawn by the memory of her own first night beneath the veil. Through the open door, she saw the women gathered around the girl, threading red silk with needles, weaving together tokens from every household. Laughter bubbled as a mother fussed with her daughter's hair, and an old aunt sang a snatch of the ancient lullaby. But the pain was gone, the notes bright and quick, stripped of sorrow. The red veil, newly woven, radiant in the morning light, was draped across the bride's lap. There was no blood, no shadow, no trace of the curse that had once haunted every stitch. Still, as An watched, she felt a faint prickle at the base of her neck, a sensation not of fear, but of memory, soft as breath. For a moment, she glimpsed her own reflection in the window glass, and behind her, the faintest shape of a woman in a tattered wedding dress, smiling gently, fading like mist in the dawn. An stepped back, uncertain whether the vision was real or simply the echo of an old dream. That night, as the village feasted and the girl donned her veil to begin her new life, An sat alone by the riverbank, listening to the laughter drift through the dusk. The water was smooth and clear, reflecting the stars. She whispered a blessing for the bride and for every woman, past, present, and future, who might one day wear the red veil. May you remember joy. May you never carry what is not yours. May sorrow pass you by. The breeze stirred the reeds. An felt peace, but also a tiny ache, an understanding that cycles never truly end. The red veil's story was not gone, only sleeping, waiting in the roots of the village and the river's song, to remind them all. Some debts, even when paid, leave their mark in the quietest corners of the soul. As the moon rose over the mountains, An closed her eyes, no longer afraid. She knew now that memory, like love and sorrow, never truly faded. It changed shape, softened, and waited for someone to listen, to mourn, to forgive. The village's newfound peace settled like a gentle blanket, but to An, the quiet sometimes felt too complete, unnaturally still, as if the land itself was listening, holding its breath. On the night before the next wedding, a hush fell heavier than any fog. The moon hung low and red, peeking through the clouds as though watching the village with a wary, ancient eye. In every house, families lit candles and set offerings of fruit and sticky rice on their altars. Mothers pressed new red veils, freshly woven but patterned after the old ones, into their daughters' trembling hands. There was laughter and song, but beneath it all, a note of unease threaded through the festivities, so faint that only those who had suffered could hear. An wandered the streets, unable to sleep. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and rain-soaked earth. She saw shadows moving behind closed shutters and heard the distant clink of bridal jewelry, the whispered prayers for happiness and protection. As midnight neared, An found herself drawn toward the heart of the village. The old temple bell rang, its sound low and hollow, calling all souls, living and dead, to witness another night of promise and fate. She paused at the threshold of a home where the newest bride sat surrounded by women, her face lit with hope, her eyes bright with fear. The red veil was draped across her lap, shining in the lamplight, innocent as any charm. But as An watched, the room seemed to shift. The lamplight grew dim, the shadows deepened, and for a breathless moment, every voice fell silent. She saw the veil shimmer, just for a heartbeat, with a darker hue, as if a thin line of blood pulsed beneath its silk. A chill slid down An's spine. She blinked, and the room returned to normal. Laughter, music, the scent of new beginnings. Yet the veil still glowed faintly in her mind's eye, as if the old curse waited quietly, forgotten but not gone. An turned away, heart heavy. She walked through the darkened lanes, the village around her full of dreams and restless spirits. Every window flickered with life, but every shadow stretched a little longer than it should. Reaching her own home, An lingered at the door, staring out at the sleeping world. For the first time, she understood that stories never truly end. Each ending is another beginning. Each freedom is a thread joined to countless others, stretching back through time. That night, sleep did not come. Instead, An sat awake, listening to the wind tell stories through the bamboo and the river murmur secrets in the dark. Sometimes she could imagine she could hear laughter and weeping carried together on the breeze. Every woman who had ever worn the veil, every hope and grief blending into a song without words. And in the endless night, she finally made her peace. Not with the past, not with the future, but with the knowledge that some things must be remembered, some lessons must be carried, and some debts can only ever be paid in the living of another day. As dawn crept over the mountains, An closed her eyes, feeling the world turn quietly onward, one more night, one more thread in the endless weaving of sorrow and love. The village awoke to a restless, uneasy morning. The sky was low and gray, the sun hidden behind heavy clouds that threatened rain but offered none. Rumors crept like cold fingers from house to house, strange footprints on the riverbank, the sound of weeping echoing before dawn, dogs howling at things no one could see. An felt the change before she saw it. The air tingled with an ancient warning. She followed the nervous glances of her neighbors down to the river, drawn by a quiet dread she could not name. A crowd had gathered in silence at the edge of the water. Women held their children close. The old men crossed themselves and muttered prayers against spirits. In the center, bobbing in the gentle current, was a shape, white as bone, hair spread wide like seaweed in the flow. As the current nudged the body toward the bank, recognition struck An's heart. It was her grandmother, the one who had walked into the water so many nights ago. Her skin pale and wrinkled, her lips drawn in a faint, sorrowful smile. Around her neck, the ghost of the red veil shimmered, glistening wet, crimson seeping through white. The villagers fell back, whispering in fear and awe. For a moment time spun and stilled. The river had returned what it was owed. An knelt by the body, hands trembling. The veil was tangled tight around her grandmother's throat, as if the curse had followed her even beyond death. Yet her face was peaceful, eyes closed, as though she had finally made her journey home. Behind An, the other women of the village wept openly, not just for the dead, but for all they had lost and carried. The red veil, soaked and frayed, slipped free in An's hands, dissolving into the river like a final thread unwinding. As she watched the current pull the last of the silk away, a hush fell. The wind stirred, and for a moment it sounded like voices, soft, grateful, released. The village elder spoke in a trembling voice. The river keeps its debts, but sometimes it gives back what we thought was gone forever. An pressed her lips to her grandmother's cold forehead and whispered a prayer of thanks and farewell. In that moment, she felt the lines of the past grow softer, the pain that had marked the women of her blood begin to ease. But as she rose, she saw the youngest girls in the crowd staring at the water, eyes wide, as if seeing shapes moving beneath the surface, braids trailing, hands beckoning from the deep. The curse had lifted, but memory could never be fully drowned. That night, as the village laid her grandmother to rest, An watched the moonlight ripple on the river. The water sang its endless song of sorrow, of return, of the stories no current can carry away. And deep inside, An understood. Some debts, even when paid, echo on the other side of the water, forever binding past to present, grief to love, the living to the dead. Seasons turned, carrying the village from grief to new beginnings. Fields were planted and harvested. Children's laughter echoed through the narrow lanes, and old wounds slowly faded into legend. The river, for all its secrets, now ran clear. Yet beneath its calm, everyone sensed that it still remembered. On the day of a new wedding, the village gathered as always, their faces bright with hope, their eyes shining with the relief of peace. The bride, dressed in a gown of cream and gold, knelt before her mother as the ceremonial red veil was lifted from its resting place, a veil freshly woven, but bearing the same design, the same ancient thread. The mother's hands trembled only slightly as she placed the veil over her daughter's hair. "This is to protect you, child," she whispered, voice thick with love and the weight of tradition. "Wear it with honor and never tear it, for it binds you to those who came before and those who will come after." The bride smiled, her heart light. No shadow crossed the threshold. The old curse had faded into story. Still, as the ceremony unfolded, An stood at the back of the crowd, watching quietly. She felt pride and an ache she could not name, a knowledge that even in peace, some threads are never wholly unwound. As the music swelled, An saw the bride catch her gaze, and just for an instant, her eyes filled with something deep and old, a flicker of recognition, of gratitude, or warning, impossible to say. Then the moment passed, swept away by laughter and celebration. Afterwards, as dusk fell and lanterns flickered to life, An walked to the river's edge, red petals drifting on the current. She thought of her mother, her grandmother, and all the silent women whose voices had once filled her dreams. She whispered a prayer, not for protection, but for remembrance. May those who wear the veil know joy. May those who bind the thread do so with choice, not fear. May no sorrow go unseen, and no blessing be left unspoken. The river glimmered beneath the moon, carrying her words away and bringing them home again. As An returned to the village, lantern light dancing on her path, she understood at last. The red veil could never truly be untied. It would live on, not as a curse, but as a gentle reminder, an inheritance of both warming and grace woven through every life that dared to remember. And so the story was not ended, but carried onward, thread by thread, mother to daughter, sorrow to hope, forever.